Chapter 3. Arrival of Prisoners. The morning of Wednesday, July 6, 1864, witnessed the arrival of the first detachment of prisoners of war. A train on the Erie Railroad pulled into the station at 6 o'clock, and from it were unloaded 400 prisoners. They were made up of two classes, the old and the young, middle age having a very small representation. They wore all sorts of nondescript uniforms, besides the regular dark dirty gray. Some had nothing on but drawers and shorts. 44 of the number had valuables and money. The officers received from them over $500 in Confederate money, $5 in greenbacks, $5.50 in silver, and 2 silver watches. As soon as they were unloaded, they marched to the prison camp in double column. A.J. Madra of Jackson's 1st Corps of Sharpshooters was the first prisoner to enter the enclosure. He headed the column, walking beside a Federal sergeant. The prison camp having been inaugurated by this arrival, things were set in motion, and 3 days later the following order was issued, which is the first evidence of medical action. Office Commissary General of Prisoners, Washington, D.C., July 9, 1864. Surgeon General T. Alexander, Acting Medical Inspector, Washington, D.C. Sir, you will proceed without delay to examine into the sanitary condition of the depot for prisoners of war just established at Elmira, New York, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Eastman, and to confer with him as to the measures necessary to be taken to place the depot in proper condition. You understand my views as to the mode of carrying out the regulations contained in the circular from this office of April 20th, and will be able to give any explanations which Colonel Eastman may desire. Make such recommendations as to the interior arrangement of the hospital as you may deem proper, and request them to be put in force. In making your report, use the forms prescribed by the medical inspectors of the Army, and remark on all matters embraced under the several headings noted therein. Having completed the inspection, you will report in person at this office. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, W. Hoffman, Colonel, 3rd Infantry and Commander General of Prisoners. Surgeon General Alexander visited the camp on July 11th and made the following report. Washington, D.C., July 14, 1864. Colonel W. Hoffman, USA, Commander General, Prisoners of War, Washington, D.C. Colonel, I have the honor to report that on the 11th of this month, complying with instructions received from you, I have inspected the camp for prisoners of war recently established at Elmira, New York. The camp is at present in good condition. Your attention is respectfully called to the sinks. Some being placed on a slough, at present stagnant, others over vaults. They may soon become offensive and a source of disease. The remedy suggested is either to bring water from the city of Elmira and construct new sinks with suitable drainage, or to cause the river near which the camp is situated to communicate with the slough, thereby producing a running stream through the camp. Upon the cost of the first method and the practicability of the second, the commanding officer was requested to inform you without delay, sending at the time a plan of the camp that all might be readily understood. The barracks for the prisoners will accommodate 5,000, and there is room sufficient in the enclosure to pitch tents for from 3,000 to 5,000 more. The barracks are of 3 sizes. First, 20, 18 feet by 88 feet, 8 high, intended for 100 of our men. Second, 8 kitchens, 18 feet square, accommodating each 28 prisoners. Third, 10, 20 feet by 80 feet, 12 feet high, intended for 150 of our men, now never used. At present, the guardhouse in the camp is occupied by prisoners other than prisoners of war, there being no secure place for them elsewhere. At present, there is no proper hospital organization. The surgeon in charge of the hospitals for the troops at Elmira visits daily the prisoners' camp. He had an assistant to look especially after the prisoners, a young man, lately a medical cadet, recently contracted with, and not a suitable person to organize or control a hospital, much as will be needed. I found the sick fortunately but few, in no way suitably provided for, except as for shelter. Diet not suitable, some without bed sacks, blankets scarce. Your attention is called to the immediate necessity of a competent surgeon to take charge. After consulting with the commanding officer, a site was chosen for a hospital, and directions given that a laundry and 3 pavilion wards should be immediately built, one to be so divided as to make suitable apartments for administrative duties. A building formerly used as a carpenter shop is so situated as to be serviceable as kitchen and mess room, and is to be altered to suit as such. The cost per ward will be about $500. I also stated to the commanding officer the necessity of having a requisition at once for supplies for a hospital of 300 beds. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, C.T. Alexander, Surgeon, USA, Acting Medical Inspector. On July 11th, the second batch of prisoners arrived at 5 a.m. They numbered 249. The advertiser says they were ragged and dirty as usual. One was barefoot and the rest indifferently shod. On July 12th, the third batch of 502 reached Elmira at 7 a.m. At the end of the first week, there were 1,151 prisoners in the camp. The official report of Surgeon Alexander on his examination made during the first week shows that the only deficiency was in the hospital organization. The surgeon he refers to as being in charge of the regular government hospitals in the city was Dr. William C. Way, Acting Assistant Surgeon, U.S. Volunteers. There were at this time 220 sick and wounded federal soldiers in the various hospitals over which he had charge. Pending the appointment of a regular surgeon for the prison camp, Surgeon Way was assigned temporarily to the additional duty of caring for the few sick prisoners. The influx of prisoners during this first week was so great that little thought had been given to sickness or death. The pressing needs accumulated faster than the machinery of government, hampered somewhat by military red tape, could find ways and means to relieve. Surgeon Alexander's recommendations received prompt attention, and under ordinary conditions the situation would have been relieved without serious inconvenience. The morning of Saturday, July 16th, brought to Elmira the startling news that there had been a frightful railroad accident at Chehola, a coal train having collided with the train bearing a detachment of prisoners of war. The city was thrown into a whirl of excitement, and the officers at the prison camp were busily occupied in making such arrangements as were possible, with the limited facilities at hand to care for the wounded prisoners on arrival. The scene at the wreck, of which there seems to be no definite record, must have been extremely painful to witness. The results, as given in the advertiser, were as follows. Prisoners killed outright and buried at Chehola, 48. Guards, 17. Prisoners badly wounded and left at hospital in Lackawanna, 15. Guards, 8. Prisoners wounded taken to Elmira, 85. Guards, 10. A new train was made up as soon as possible and proceeded on its way. It consisted of 20 cars, the first 6 containing wounded prisoners. The train reached Elmira at 9:30 p.m. Colonel Eastman and Surgeon Way were on the spot to direct the work of unloading the wounded. All the U.S. baggage wagons at the post, 12 in number, were on hand, lined up to receive the wounded, the bottoms all covered with hay, to make the journey as easy as possible. The sick and ailing who were unable to walk were also put into the wagons. Those who could walk were marched to the camp, and on arrival were provided with a good, comfortable meal to offset the enforced fast occasioned by the delay. One of the regular barracks had been hastily emptied to provide the best possible quarters for the wounded. The wounded guards were sent to the general hospital to be cared for by the nurses as best they could. Surgeon Way turned his attention immediately to the prisoners, and with all the assistance he could procure, toiled patiently and steadily through that long Saturday night till daylight in his efforts to dress the wounds, but it was impossible to give attention to so many in so short of time. The scarcity of lint and bandages crippled them in their work. This supply had been ample for any ordinary requirement, but the extraordinary demand exhausted the supply to be had in all the government hospitals, and little could be done till more was obtained. Surgeon Way did not wait for official orders and requisitions, but in some way got word to all the city pastors, so that they went forth on that Sunday morning from every pulpit a stirring appeal to the ladies for lint, bandages, and delicacies, with the request that any contributions be sent at once to his own residence, so that he might personally see that they reached the prison camp in the shortest possible time. The same appeal was published in the Advertiser on Monday morning. The response was immediate and contributions were sent in, not only by the ladies of Elmira, but from many adjoining towns, so that on Sunday and Monday, everyone who needed attention received it. The Ladies' Hospital Aid Association also responded quickly with liberal supplies of delicacies in addition to the dressings needed. This association had been organized in the early days of the war to provide needed supplies to be sent to the front. They responded with the same alacrity and cheerful spirit to the call for aid to the suffering Confederates, which had before characterized their labors for our own wounded at the front. The suddenness of the emergency and the scarcity of medical assistance as well as supplies made it impossible to properly care for so great a number as quickly as might have been desirable. The Herculean task was not completed till Monday noon. Some might say that in such an emergency other city physicians should have been called in to assist. The situation was just this. All the leading surgeons of Elmira, except Dr. Way, were in active service at the front, and the sick citizens of Elmira were left to the mercy of what little attention Surgeon Way might be able to render during his supposed hours of rest, assisted by medical students or nurses. This statement is made to answer the criticism of Mr. Keeley in his book charging a criminal neglect because some of the wounded prisoners were still unattended on Monday morning. The evidence would indicate that everything possible was done to meet this startling emergency, with no thought or treatment different from that which would have been accorded our own soldiers. As a matter of fact, the wounded guards were actually neglected and delegated to the care of inexperienced nurses, that the Confederates might receive the best attention under the circumstances. Captain M.H. Church, 11th VRC, was sent to Shohola on July 22nd to direct the conveyance of such wounded as could be moved to Elmira. He returned with 7 brought on movable beds. The following is the official report of the accident and its result. Barracks No. 3, Elmira, New York, July 22, 1864. Lieutenant Colonel Eastman, Commanding Depot. Sir, as officer in command of guard in charge of prisoners of war from Point Lookout, I have to report that we left on steamer Crescent with a guard of 125 men and 3 commissioned officers, and 833 prisoners on the eve of July 12th. Arrived at New York at 3 p.m., July 14th, and disembarked at Jersey City at 4 a.m. on the 15th. Left Jersey City via Erie Railway, and at 3 p.m. came in collision with a coal train near Shohola, PA, causing a complete wreck of the train and killing 14 of the guard and 40 of the prisoners instantly, mortally wounding 3 of the guard and 8 prisoners, all of whom have since died, and wounding 16 of the guard and 93 prisoners. Nearly all the guards on duty were either killed or wounded, and immediately I caused the reserve to be posted around the wreck and prisoners to prevent their escape. The wounded were extricated as soon as possible and taken to Shohola, where every attention was rendered by the citizens and guard. The wounded all being cared for, the dead were buried in the immediate vicinity of the accident, and each grave properly designated. The prisoners were removed to Shohola, where we remained until 11 a.m. July 16th, when we proceeded on our way, arriving in Elmira at 9:30 p.m. Many of the prisoners killed were so disfigured that it was impossible to recognize them, and 5 escaping whose names are unknown. I am unable to give you a correct list of killed. Respectfully, your obedient servant, Morris H. Church, Captain, 11th VRC, Commanding Guard. This report fixes the correct number and agrees with Major Colt's tally of prisoners according to the following figures. U.S. Guards killed outright, 14. Wounded, since died, 3. Wounded, sent on, 16. Prisoners killed outright, 40. Wounded, since died, 8. Wounded, left at Shohola, 7. Wounded, sent on, 86. Prisoners escaped, 5. Prisoners delivered at Elmira, 780. This also reconciles the report of bodies removed to Elmira in 1911 and explains why no accurate record can be made as to the names of the dead. The 5 who escaped were unknown, and the bodies of the dead being mostly mutilated beyond recognition. It became a hard matter to prepare a list with absolute accuracy. The death roll, however, is fixed at 48 prisoners and 17 guards. Of the wounded, 86 were moved at once and 7 later, making 93 as reported. Colonel W. M. Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, came to Elmira July 20th and spent the day examining the conditions existing at the prison camp. He expressed himself as highly pleased with the accommodations which had been devised for the comfort and convenience of the prisoners. The prison camp rapidly increased in population. At the end of the month, 4,424 prisoners had been received. In order that the guards might be able to see what's going on at night within the enclosure, 41 large kerosene oil lamps having immense reflectors were hung up on the inside of the stockade fence, distributed at regular distances. These lights were first used on the night of July 26th. Under the strict rules of military prisons, no citizens were allowed to enter the grounds. All the opportunity outsiders had of seeing the prisoners was while they were being transferred from the cars to the enclosure. About the 20th of July, a peculiar structure began to take shape opposite the prison. It was located about 150 feet west of Hoffman Street, and probably on the premises now occupied by Mr. William H. Lovell. The 2 trees shown in plate number 6 stand just inside the sidewalk in front of the house now occupied by Mr. Fred M. Wixon, number 710 West Water Street. The observatory is shown in the picture. Mr. Keeley describes it as follows. Our curiosity has been excited for some days past by noticing a wooden structure consisting of 2 large platforms, one above the other, which has been going up across the road that bounds one face of our prison. I learned today that it is an observatory, where the sightseeing pension of the Yanks is to be made available to put money into the purse of an enterprising partnership which proposes to turn our pen into a menagerie and exhibit the inmates to the refined and valorous people of the Chemung Valley, at the modest fee of 15 cents a head. Refreshments served below. The event justified the wisdom of the venture, for one of the proprietors, who was part of the management in our pen, assured me that the concern paid for itself in 2 weeks. I am surprised that Barnum has not taken the prisoners off the hands of Abe, divided them into companies, and carried them in caravans through the country, after the manner of Sesostris and other antique heroes, turning an honest penny by the show. So profitable was this peculiarly Yankee institution that a week or 2 thereafter a rival establishment, taller by a score of feet, sprang up and a grand sightseeing and spruce beer warfare began, which shook Elmira to its uttermost depths. One building was radical, the other copperhead. One was taller, the other older and more original. Qualifications considered important by Dr. Sands, and quite as apropos to sightseeing as to Sarsaparilla. Heaven knows where it would have ended, but that the government confiscated the Democratic platform under the plea of military necessity, and its abolition brother remained master of the situation. Here every summer afternoon the population of Elmira, chiefly of the female persuasion, congregated to feast their eyes on their enemies, much after the fashion that the worshippers of Dagon mocked the mighty son of Manoah, and until the days became so cold that exposure in so high a position was unpleasant, the shin plasters rolled in and the lemon pop and ginger cakes rolled out of the Orthodox Observatory, to the great pecuniary comfort of the true believers who owned it. Patriotism is spelled with a Y at the end of the first syllable up here. The humorous account of our witty prisoner gives a very correct impression of the observatory history in most particulars. The first mention in the advertiser was on July 28th, when it refers to a large elevated platform outside the barracks which commands a view to the enclosure. On August 30th, a regular advertisement appears in the advertiser of the observatory, 3 stories high, conducted by W&W Mears. Admission 10 cents. On September 9th, the advertiser mentions that there are 2 observatories in operation, both doing a rushing business. The second observatory was on the corner of Hoffman Street, now occupied by E.A. Warner's grocery store. Between the 2 observatories, and in fact all along Water Street, near the camp, was a long row of wooden booths, like those at a fair, built in a night and doing business the next day. They all sold cakes, peanuts, crackers, lemonade, beer, and sometimes even stronger drinks. They were of short life. Nothing but the original observatory was permitted to remain. The commanding officer ordered the rival observatory on the corner and all the booths to be raised. They came down quicker even than they went up, and their occupants vanished from the site. The original observatory, which remained through the existence of the camp, is nicely shown in plate number 6. A religious sentiment developed very early in the history of the camp. The Advertiser of July 21st says the rebel prisoners have organized prayer meetings and other religious services and made application for religious reading, Bibles, tracts, etc. Permission was given by Lieutenant Colonel Eastman for any religious publications to be sent to prisoners. The YMCA takes active charge of the distribution. Arrangements were made for a preaching service in the prison camp on Sunday afternoons at 5 o'clock. The Reverend Thomas K. Beecher preached the first sermon Sunday, July 24th. The prisoners turned out in full force and listened attentively. Regular services were conducted every Sunday, the following pastors officiating a regular turn: Thomas K. Beecher, A.C. George, S.M. Bainbridge, T.O. Lincoln, and Mr. Gerlau. The Advertiser of July 27th says the annual report of the YMCA shows that they have distributed 4,175 testaments, 21,735 religious newspapers, and 1,000 daily papers to soldiers and prisoners of war. Also under date of September 1st, large contributions of religious books and papers are received weekly from the U.S. Christian Commission and YMCA. Also under date of February 7, 1865, there are 1,511 prisoners who profess religion, 547 Baptists, 542 Methodists, 110 Presbyterians, and 242 Roman Catholics. The following correspondence is of interest in connection with the religious sentiment of prisoners. This letter was probably written to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Moore in 1865. At all events, the printed letter, of which this is a copy, was found in Colonel Moore's scrapbook. My command was captured in one of the desperate assaults before Petersburg. We were taken to Point Lookout and then to Elmira. As we drew into Elmira, the sun was beaming down upon us in all its beauty and brightness, and it was very hot. The train was soon emptied of its living freight, and the column formed 4 abreast, headed toward the prison camp. The depot was thronged with people, the greater part ladies and children, all handsomely dressed, gazing upon us with a variety of expressions, some with gladness, some with sadness, and some with a sympathetic look, as if moved by a Christian heart, touched by a common feeling for suffering humanity. The rider was hatless and coatless, having lost his hat on the train, and marched down the street in that condition. A lady on the sidewalk said, "See that poor man without a hat? I wish the guard would let me give him one." The look that lady gave me remains with me to this day. It carried earnestness with it, and a reality in what she said. We soon reached the camp and marched into our new quarters. The situation was by far more desirable than at Point Lookout. Here everything was new and clean. The tents were new. The grass was green in many places, and walnut trees standing here and there about the grounds. All around the outside could be seen mountainous scenery covered with evergreens, affording a splendid relief to the eye. Within the camp was a pond, around the sides of which was tall grass of a flossy nature. The water, oh, the water which we had longed for so much, was now at hand. Wells were dug at convenient distances from each other in the enclosure. They were shallow, not over 8 or 10 feet deep. About 6 feet, and you were through stones from the size of an egg to that of a peck measure, then white, coarse sand, and pure, cool, sparkling water. Oh, how we enjoyed the water! Our dry, parched, and feverish throats were no longer to suffer. The little giant cucumbers would be pumped by the hour, and the water would still come, pure as ever. Our tent was in Ward 46. The weather was delightful during August and September. The camp was soon filled with prisoners. The commissary department was poorly supplied at first and badly managed. An officer with the rank of captain made himself very obnoxious to all. He carried too many pistols in his belt, which made him cross and crabbed. It was not long, however, before a change was made, which resulted in an improvement. As the fall came on, it was quite cold at night. We pulled down some tall grass, dried it in the sun, and made a bed of it. The scurvy was among us, and as the cold weather advanced, the death rate increased rapidly. Scurvy, typhoid, pneumonia, and finally smallpox broke out to an alarming extent, carrying off great numbers of the poor fellows. Hospital wards were commenced soon after the camp was fairly started. These were well built and nicely arranged. A ward contained about 75 patients and was as comfortable as could be built, with good cots, and they were well heated. As fast as the wards were finished, they were filled with sick. The weather soon got cold and continued so. The ground became frozen, hard and dry, and a shower of snow was more frequent than a shower of rain in April, and far more lasting. It came to stay, and as winter approached we had streets as clean as linen and as slick as glass. A large quantity of wood, chiefly spruce, was kept in the enclosure, and a constant hauling kept up principally with sleighs. This wood was dealt out every day, so many sticks to a tent. The wood was inadequate to our needs, and the art of stealing was practiced to a very high degree. It was a novelty to walk through the camp and see the variety of amusements going on. Checkers, chess, cards, dominoes, and all manner of devices to while away the time. Trinkets were made of bone, horn, gutta-percha, horsehair, and wood, into almost every conceivable thing. Buttons, combs, fans, rings, watch chains, toothpicks, and many other things. The horses driven into camp had their tails badly notched. Quite a lively business was carried on with the sutler. There was a perfect mania for traffic. We saw a man coming from breakfast exchange his slice of bread for a chew of tobacco, saying the tobacco would pacify his stomach for 2 hours, while the bread would only aggravate it. In the midst of all this routine, a party in Ward 46 who lived in a tent near the stockade were engaged in another and altogether different employment. They were working underground and engineering a route beyond the enclosure by which they might escape, and they were successful. After they escaped, the act bore heavily on all of us. There was a thorough inspection made in the whole ward, and all the planks and grass for beds were taken from us, and our already hard beds were reduced to the naked ground, making all suffer for the disobedience of the few. Until the weather became too cold, we had religious services twice a day, morning and evening. The place of meeting was at a pole driven in the ground on an open space. The meetings were largely attended. Songs of praise were sung, exhortations made, and fervent prayers offered to our Heavenly Father from devout hearts for His protection and care, and on behalf of all who desired to be prayed for. We have seen many a poor fellow with sunken eyes and pale face, with uplifted hands say, "Pray for me," and men would bring their friends who were sick and unable to come alone, that they might make their requests known. We enjoyed those meetings. Never shall we forget them. The dispensary was manned by prisoners. A man was fortunate if he were a druggist, as he could get a good berth at once. I was fortunately appointed to a position in this department. Medicine and suitable food were supplied without stint. Many times did we sing, at the bedside in subdued tones, those comforting songs, Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me, and Jesus, Lover of my soul. I shall ever remember the colonel in charge, Colonel Stephen Moore, and would be thoroughly delighted to meet him now, if he be living. I walked out one evening late. The full moon was sending her soft light over everything. From the tall flagstaff near the entrance gate, a large flag was waving its graceful folds in the gentle breeze. I soliloquied, "That flag has done me no harm. This is the flag of the country for which my ancestors fought. I remember, when a child, listening to one as he sat in the corner smoking his pipe, tell of Valley Forge, Cowpens, and Yorktown. That is the flag under which I was born. I can wrap its folds around me, but why am I a prisoner under it? Let the history of the late uncivil war answer. That chapter is dark and stains the fair page of American history." L.B. Jones. During the existence of the prison camp, the late Casper S. Decker lived on West Water Street, 2 blocks below the camp. Corroborative evidence of the religious meetings referred to in Mr. Jones' letter is given, as well as many other facts of interest in the following letter from a son, Mr. Casper G. Decker, president of the Elmira Knitting Mills. Elmira, New York, February 29, 1912. My dear Mr. Holmes, I am glad to give you what I can remember my father's saying about the prison camp here. It was on West Water Street, about a quarter of a mile above where we lived. and I can remember the prisoners marching up the street guarded by the Union soldiers. They were ragged and made a great contrast to their captors, in their better uniforms of blue. They were religious men, and often at night we could hear the sound of singing, and we knew that they were holding prayer meetings and singing hymns in the prison yard. My father once asked one of the Union officers if the prisoners were as religious as they appeared to be, and the officer said to him, "I believe that they are. It is a very rare thing for me to hear a prisoner swear, while our soldiers are swearing all the time." When cold weather came, provision was made for fuel for the prison camp, and the prisoners were allowed to send representatives out to inspect the wood brought to the gates by farmers from the surrounding country, and see that their appropriation was properly spent. It was their privilege to reject any wood they were offered when they did not like the quality or measurement, and my father was interested in the appearance and manner of the men whom they sent out as inspectors. I have an imperfect recollection of going up in a tower which was built on Water Street, opposite the camp, and looking over into the prison for a little time. The use of this tower was soon prohibited, as it was found from its signals were being made to the prisoners within. They were allowed to earn a little money in such ways as they could, and some coarse wood cutting and carving was done. One favorite form was a small strip of pine wood about 3/4 of an inch square with 3/4 inch sections cut out into a series of chambers so that only the 4 corners of the strip remain, and the parts between these sections. The wood which has been inside was not removed, but was carved into the form of a ball too large to escape. Often there were 4 or 5 of these chambers and balls, and at the end of all, 1 or 2 links of wooden chain were carved from the same block, the first link passing through a ring which was carved at the end of the last chamber. Much patience must have been required to make these, as a break in any point would destroy all the work. I also remember a little block of wood, nearly an inch thick and less than 3 inches square, which was carved to represent a book. There was pencil ruling on either side and back like the marking done nowadays on the cover of a ledger or journal. This was hollowed out from the front to the back and a little slide inserted to cover the opening and preserve the form of the book, being concave to represent the edges of the leaves. There was a notch in this slide, and when anyone holding the book would try to draw down the slide to open it, the curved head and neck of a little black snake with coal black eyes would come out. Impelled by the movement of the slide, and a pinpoint in the mouth of the snake would hit the finger of the person opening the book. I can remember this as a wonderful toy, and I deceived many of my friends to whom I gave the book to open. Yours very truly, Casper G. Decker. Mr. Keeley writes in his book, Major Colt suggested yesterday, Saturday, July 23rd, that it might be desired by some of the prisoners to have divine service regularly on Sunday, and added that if an application were made out, he would forward it to Colonel Eastman, who commanded the post, and who would doubtless approve it. This was done, and the clergymen of the city readily assented to the proposition to visit the prison alternately. Under this arrangement, we had service this evening, and almost every Sunday afternoon thereafter. The first minister who visited us was Reverend Thomas K. Beecher, a brother of the notorious Henry Ward, who cultivates politics, preaching, and potatoes to much temporal advantage. As the world knows, Tom is not as sound on the crow as Ward, and gave us a very practical, sensible, and liberal talk. During his sermon, 625 more prisoners arrived. A very pleasant reference to Mr. Beecher is made in a letter written by Enos Lyons, which appears in a later chapter. Among the local clergymen who visited the prisoners was the Reverend Martin Cavanaugh, then rector of St. Peter and Paul's Roman Catholic Church. His ecclesiastical superior, Reverend John Timon, first Bishop of Buffalo, was an ardent Unionist, but had great love and sympathy for the Southerners, having long labored as a missionary in the Southland. He visited the prison once, celebrated Mass, and preached. Father Cavanaugh was a frequent visitor on weekdays, then celebrating the Mass. The day before it was his custom to hear the confessions of prisoners of the Catholic faith. After the Masses, usually solemnized out the doors, he would deliver a sermon, but following the discipline of his church, it was devoted wholly to an explanation of the Gospels, and intended solely to promote spiritual consolation. He visited the sick and dying who sought from his religious ministrations peace of mind and spirit, and bestowed the last rites of his church to all dying in the Catholic faith. Father Kavanaugh was of a reserved but resolute nature, and never hesitated in duty when contagion visited the camp. His picture, as shown in Plate 21, was taken at a date near that period. Of the boys who went to the prison camp with Father Kavanaugh to serve him at the Mass, Mr. John Moore, who for many years has been the capable editor-in-chief of the Elmira Telegram, still survives. Father Kavanaugh and all the rest have passed away. Among the Protestant clergy who ministered to the prisoners, none seemed to be so popular as the Reverend Thomas K. Beecher, due in great measure to the fact that his sermons were never tinctured with anything which savored of politics or the war. Thomas K. Beecher lived many years, dearly loved by his own people, as well as the entire community. So great was the regard in which he was held by the citizens of Elmira that after his death 12 years ago, a bronze statue was erected by popular subscription and placed in the park which fronts the church in which for so many years he served his people.